Ohio at the Claremont County Airport. Thank you for joining us for Sporty's Virtual Airshow Month and also for our latest webinar presentation, Sharpening Your Flying Skills. My name is Eric Radke, and I am your host for today. I have the privilege of leading the educational team at Sporty's, which includes our very active flight school at the Claremont County Airport. So I also have the benefit of interacting pretty much daily with students and pilots, many just like you of all skill levels. And I've certainly come to understand that every pilot, no matter their experience level, has skills that could use some refreshing, and there's always new skills to learn. That brings some, with everything going on in the world and in the country, it maybe brings some added focus and attention to our need to think about proficiency and getting back into flying because, many of us, some not by choice, we were away from the flight deck for a considerable period of time. So again, no matter your experience level, it really, I think, demands some extra focus and extra attention, and certainly applaud everyone for joining us today because that certainly indicates that you have a willingness and interest in learning a little more and getting a little better, and that's what we need in aviation, certainly. Before I get too much further, I'd like to offer a big thanks to our sponsor, Sporty's Pilot Shop, who supports free webinar presentations throughout the year on the same venue. You can always view our schedule and also access any of our recorded presentations, and those are numerous, at sportys.com/webinars and also on our YouTube channel. And speaking of recorded webinars, we are also recording today's presentation. So if you have to step away for any reason or wish to come back to review a particular topic, you're welcome to do that as often as you'd like, whenever you would like, as soon as we post the recording, which we'll do right away, to our archive, and that'll also be available on the Sporty's YouTube channel as well. Throughout the presentation, you can submit questions that you may have via the GoToWebinar software. I would certainly hope that we will answer many questions as the presentation goes on, but you're welcome to do that. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the handout section of your webinar software, and we do have several PDF documents and downloads related to the topics that we'll be covering today. So you're welcome to grab those handouts and download that to your devices whenever you'd like, review them at your convenience. They're an opportunity to expand on some of the topics we'll be covering. We have an hour of time. That doesn't mean we can get to everything. We're going to touch on some key topics, but hopefully many of the topics that we touch on will prompt you or inspire you to maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of those topics, and the handouts will certainly help with that. And then you can also explore, of course, around on our webinar YouTube channel and other Sporty's resources to get in there a little bit further. I'd like to invite some audience participation, actually, before we get much further, to just get a feel for everyone in our virtual classroom, kind of where everyone stands. And it'll give me an idea of where everyone stands just in terms of your experience level and what you're looking to do. So we'll go ahead and put this poll into the field and give just a brief moment for people to respond. Well, great to see that we have a majority of actually individuals that identify themselves as being current, but always trying to learn more. So that's awesome to see. We certainly have also a portion of our audience that have been away for a considerable time, and those just getting started. That will certainly help, me focus on some specific areas and guide the conversation. But rest assured, I think we have valuable content for everyone on board. So we'll just a brief overview of what we'll be covering. So we are going to start, for those of you who have been away from flying for a considerable time, we are going to talk briefly about what it takes to be PIC again. There's some myths, there's some common misconceptions that go along with that. So we'll try to debunk some of those myths and talk to you in fact about what there is to do. We'll highlight some of the things that may have changed since the last time you were flying, and help prepare you for a return to the sky by touching on some of these kind of key flight review type topics: airspace, some new technology, weather, of course, Brief mention of a few important regulations to be aware of, some flight planning considerations, and then some tips and advice, some insights on how to kind of stay fresh and stay active and stay current so you don't find yourself back in the same situation again. So first and foremost, steps to getting back to PIC if you're an existing pilot. That pilot's license you have, that plastic certificate, it doesn't come with an expiration date, making it a great value, of course, but there are some things we need to do to keep our certificate current, and one of those is a flight review. A flight review is not a check ride. There's not a requirement that you schedule with a designated pilot examiner or get with an FAA inspector. A flight review is a training session with an instructor, with any certified flight instructor. It doesn't require a knowledge test. It should really prompt you to do some of maybe your own review, because there is a ground training requirement to a flight review of at least an hour, and it requires at least an hour flight. But the flight review is a train to proficiency type event. It's not a pass-fail event. It's simply the instructor working with you, a team effort, getting you to a point, a comfortable point, a proficiency level point where both you and the instructor are confident of your safety in the airplane and your ability to execute the privileges of your certificate. I would certainly encourage, as we do with all of our clients, to be an active participant and take an ownership role in the flight review process. Instructors have specific requirements that they have to cover, but there's also a lot of latitude of things they can cover. So as much as you can help steer and guide that conversation, I think you'll just find the experience that much more enjoyable and that much more valuable. You are required by regulation to have a flight review every 24 calendar months, every 2 years, to kind of note that on your schedule. However, there's nothing to say that you can't do a flight review or have a flight review experience on a more regular basis. I personally work with a lot of clients to do that on an annual basis. I know there are some aviation insurance underwriters that like to see some type of instructor activity or training activity at least every year. So it's not really a one size fits all. Do as much as you're comfortable or confident with. But if you've been out of the airplane for a few months, it's a good opportunity, regardless of where you stand with respect to your flight review being due. It'd be a good opportunity to reset your flight review. Next, getting back to PIC, determine what type of medical certificate that you may need, if you need a medical certificate at all. And we're going to talk a little more extensively about this relatively new medical privilege that we can fly under for private or recreational type flying, called basic med, which kind of is a new pathway outside the traditional medical certificate process. I'd also encourage you to take advantage and explore some of the wonderful video-based training resources that are out there. Some paid, some free, whatever the case may be, but what kind of online self-paced distance learning does for you, it allows you to customize the experience. It allows you to view and review over and over again and focus in on areas that you have identified or you know that may be weaker content areas. That is really the big value proposition there, is customization and the ability for you to do it when it's convenient, on your schedule, on your own time. And a lot of this content can be consumed on your mobile devices, on your big screen TV, whatever the case may be. Consider a seminar. Even though we're not doing across the country a whole lot of in-person events with crowds, there's still a great number of virtual learning opportunities out there, including today's, like you're on for this webinar presentation. Certainly there's some other, the Rusty Pilot seminar series from AOPA is ongoing, which is a little more extensive and can also count as your ground knowledge requirement towards the flight review. So take a look at some of those virtual learning opportunities for sure. An additional step to being current to carrying passengers, and this kind of tiptoes into the regulatory area that we're going to get to as well, but 6157 does require that in order for you to carry passengers, you do have to have accomplished and logged, of course, 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category. So airplane probably for most of us, and also class, that meaning single or multi-engine, in the previous 90-day period. if you're accomplishing those landings, or for night landing currency, I should say, those landings are required to be to a full stop. And that would be if you're flying passengers from the period of 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. Now, this it brings up an interesting topic and some of the confusion out there between what night means, because the FAA really defines night in several different ways depending on what it's related to. So there's this concept of having position lights on, or your navigation lights on, and that's required to be on from the period of sunset to sunrise. Then there's this issue of logging nighttime. What is nighttime? Well, nighttime is officially defined as the end of evening twilight to the beginning of morning twilight. That's kind of the common sense one. Hey, if it's dark, you're able to log nighttime. This 1 hour after to 1 hour before, that's not, I mean, that's something you really have to pay attention to in order to fully meet the kind of regulatory interpretation there. But specifically, it's an hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise for landing currency. Back to this issue of medicals. So you may be looking or may be required to renew your medical certificate, and some of this probably has changed since some of you obtained your medical certificate. But there's this new pathway called basic med. So if your medical expired anytime prior to July of 2006, now that's going back quite a long time for probably most of you, you will have to have a new traditional medical certificate. You will also have to have a traditional medical certificate if you're going to utilize first or second class privileges. So essentially, if you're getting paid for your flying, if you're in some commercial operation, airline operation, you have to have a first or second class medical. You have to go the traditional medical route, filling out the medical application, going to see your aviation medical examiner. But you do not need a medical and may choose to fly under the basic med rules if you're doing any type of private or third class medical privilege flying, and you've held that valid medical post July 15th, 2006, that allows you to use basic med. We'll go into basic med just a little bit further in a moment. Also, gliders, for those glider pilots that might be out there, you do not have to have a traditional medical, just the driver's license standard, and the same goes with flying light sport aircraft. So again, to repeat, you're eligible for basic med if you've held any valid medical after July 2006. You're going to stick to third class certificate privileges, which is any and all personal type flying. The FAA does set a limit of a max of 5 passengers, maximum 6 seats. So any kind of six seat GA aircraft or smaller would fit this requirement. The aircraft can weigh no more than 6,000 pounds. You are also restricted to 250 knots and 18,000 feet. And basic med extends even beyond the United States. It's valid in Bahamas and Mexico. Now, what do you have to do to be able to fly under basic med? Kind of 2 steps here. You have to, number 1, complete an online training course that's free, and it's required to be done every 2 years. There's this free course available through AOPA, and there's also one available through Mayo Clinic. Has to be done every 2 years. You should always make a notation in your logbook or other electronic record, however you keep your flight log, that you've completed it and when. It's required every 2 years. Step 2, you have to complete an FAA provided checklist for basic med with a physician, any state licensed physician. So the whole premise or the concept and the vision for basic med is that this would save all of us pilots kind of an extra step or extra effort and even extra expense. Instead of going to a designated AME, most of us are seeing a primary care physician, hopefully within a 4-year time period, but certainly at least every 4 years, probably for a basic checkup or a basic physical. And this is a checklist then that medical professional could complete with you, and they sign off on it. There's some self-assessment that you go through, and you as the pilot sign off on it as well. And again, you document that and make that notation in your logbook. As long as you do those 2 steps, so it's 2 and 4 years process, 2 years, every 2 years training, every 4 years visit to a physician, have your driver's license, you're good to fly under basic med. There's no need to go back and get a traditional medical certificate. There's a much more in-depth guide we have available to you at sportystudentpilotnews.com. If you want to make a quick notation or take a pic, studentpilotnews.com, and search for Pilot's Guide to Basic Med, or just search Basic Med, and there's a very comprehensive, easy to understand, written by Pilot's Guide to everything Basic Med. Back to the traditional medical route, if you do have to go that route, your application for the medical is all done online now through medexpress.faa.gov. So you do that before you go and visit the AME. And again, if you're in generally good health, not taking regular medication, your vision, whether it's corrected, whether it's been surgery to get you there, is at least 20/40. That is certainly good enough to obtain that third-class medical. Medical durations, they're good for 5 years, 60 months as long as you're under the age of 40 when you get the certificate itself, and it's 2 years or 24 months if you are 40 or over 40 based on the exam date. Now, for anyone that has been caught up in the COVID shutdown with an expiring medical, the FAA has issued some relief on that. And if you had a medical that did expire anytime between March and September of this year, the FAA has granted a 3 calendar month extension to that. So if you were one of the ones that just couldn't get an appointment to see your medical exam, you may have some extra time depending on when that expired. Now, if you are an existing pilot and you decide that you don't have to go or don't want to go basic med, you just want to use a driver's license medical standard and take advantage of flying a sport aircraft, or if you have purchased a sport aircraft, you can do it simply by letting your medical lapse. You let your medical lapse and you stick to the sport pilot guidelines, get your flight review. There's nothing more you have to do from a medical perspective, other than, of course, your ongoing obligation to self-certify. Let's talk about some newer technologies that may have developed since the last time you were in the cockpit, and the technology is coming so quickly and so rapidly, it seems like it's really hard to keep up with what has really been transformative to so many aspects of our lives, not just in aviation, but it has been the widespread adoption of the iPad and the numerous applications that have been created out there, the wonderfully creative innovations that have made our lives so much easier and safer on the flight deck. We've gone in the pilot community more towards being able to access information, all this information that can be stored on the devices, versus having to remember or recall a lot of information, like a system that many of us grew up in or many of us trained in, because we can, again, have documents loaded on our devices. We can see all of our charting data essentially in real time. We can even have weather and traffic overlaid. You can have all that there to make for much easier interpretation, so we're not relying so much on faulty memories, if you will. So iPads in the cockpit are in widespread use, widely acceptable. They are a legal replacement for all those old paper charts that you may be used to. Most people are not folding out sectionals or IFR and route charts. They're simply pulling up their favorite charting app on their iPad to access all of that information, and even doing a lot of their flight planning functions on this as well. The electronic flight bags, if it's brand new to you, we have another dedicated resource from Sporty's, iPadPilotNews.com, free subscription, free content. We tackle every topic related to iPad use on the flight deck, from selecting an iPad, from mounting your iPad device, tips and tricks for using your iPad, pre-flighting your iPad, the list goes on and on and on. So I would certainly recommend, if you're not a subscriber, go ahead and do that. It's absolutely free. If you're on right now with us and you're thinking, I'm ready to make the leap, I'm ready to make this change into the modern age of information on the flight deck, our quick advice on an iPad, if you're shopping for something new, would be go with 11-inch iPad Pro or the iPad Mini, just depending on how much space you have available to you on the flight deck. Me personally, if you have the space, I would go with full-size iPad. I think it just gives you a lot more flexibility and ways to use it, both inside and outside the flight deck. If space is an issue, or maybe you wish to dedicate an iPad for aviation use, the iPad mini is an ideal size for instrument approach charts in particular. So that's the quick insight to an iPad, procuring an iPad. Some of the apps you may wish to consider, and we're not going to go into depth into any of these, but these are just a few ideas to maybe prompt you to explore a little bit further. ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, Flight Plan Go, WingX. Most of these charting app providers do offer free trials. So without investing much money, not that it's a major investment to begin with, relatively speaking, but most of these apps give you ample opportunity to fully test drive and interact. And for a lot of these apps, it's, a lot of them ultimately accomplish the same thing, but of course the user interfaces are a little bit different, and one is probably going to feel a little more intuitive than the other. It's kind of like choosing between Pepsi and Coke. There's certainly, chocolate or vanilla ice cream. There's kind of room for both. People are going to be partial to different thing and different aspects of how you access information, what this information looks like. And that's what kind of makes it worthwhile to explore these apps in a little more detail. Weather and traffic on your iPad is available now for minimal investment. You can purchase these receivers that receive the free government ground-based ADSB broadcast. We'll get into ADSB a little bit further and talk to you a little more about what it's about. But practically speaking, it gets you a lot of the information you traditionally would rely on internet to be able to get in the airplane itself. So with a portable ADSB receiver, you can link that to your EFB device, your iPad, and you can get weather information. You can get traffic information. You can get GPS positioning source so you can overlay the aircraft position. Many of these devices also offer backup AHRS, that's attitude information like is pictured there. So you can see attitude information, heading, speed, altitude, all those things as an emergency backup. And this is government based. This is absolutely free. Charting data in the device itself, of course, is an investment, but the information being broadcast to these portable receivers and then displayed on your portable device, that's absolutely free. Let's turn our attention, we'll come back to ADSB too. We want to turn our attention very briefly to airspace, and the reason this will be very brief is because I firmly believe that being able to view some of this information in text form is going to be a little bit easier. And this is information, these are documents that you could have with you. You can print it out, you can download it to your iPad device. There's not a whole lot of need, I don't believe, in this modern age to commit a whole lot of this to memory, but it is good to have a general awareness. And of course, airspace review is indeed a flight review requirement. In the handout section that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there is a kind of quick reference airspace guide that summarizes a lot of this information. But quickly to review, in the US, the National Airspace System, in order of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, we go from most restrictive to the least restrictive. Starting with Class B, those are your big airports. Those are your Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, the big airports, typically a 30-mile radius, but they can all be customized. Each have VFR cloud clearance requirements, of course. In the case of Class B, 3 miles clear clouds. Big distinction or big takeaway here with Class B airspace is this is the surface airspace around these big airports that actually requires permission to enter. It's more than just establishing two-way radio communications. If you are a VFR aircraft, you have to be explicitly cleared into Class B airspace. So be very cautious and very aware of where that's located, and make sure that you are hearing those words, you are cleared into the Class B or Class Bravo airspace. And if there's any doubt, of course, ask for clarification. Class C airspace indicated on sectionals with the solid magenta, typically 5 to 10 miles in radius, generally up to about 4,000 feet above the ground. Does require a transponder, does require two-way communications, but the big difference here, it just requires that two-way communication be established. It's not required that you actually receive a clearance as a VFR aircraft into the airspace. Now, if you're IFR, whether that's Class B or C, there's not any kind of specific clearance required for any of these. Class D, probably the least busy in terms of towered airports, about 4 nautical miles in radius. typically up to about 2,500 feet AGL, and again requires the two-way radio communication be established prior to entering. Class E transition areas. In this particular case, in the lighter shading of the magenta, the Class E begins at 700 feet AGL. Outside begins at 1,200 feet AGL. And let's see, the typical 152, if you want to use that kind of that device, that memory device or that memory aid to remember your VFR cloud clearance requirements, and this starts controlled airspace. You can also see Class E to the surface. And again, this is non-towered airport, but noted in the dashed magenta line as opposed to the shaded magenta lines. Be very aware if you've been out of the flight deck for a while, and those of you who are active, it's certainly probably always on your mind of TFRs. This is an election year, like it or not. So presidential TFRs, which are typically 30 miles, a 30-mile radius, they can pop up at a moment's notice and follow the president of the United States wherever he may be. So we're getting in, or we'll be getting into, a very busy presidential travel season. So we'll see a lot of these TFRs popping up. Some other TFRs to be aware of are the sporting event TFRs. And these TFRs, even with people not in the stands, they are still in effect by definition, because it doesn't require a certain amount of people to be in the stands. It just relates to a seating capacity, and specifically relates to MLB, NFL, NCAA Division I, NASCAR, Indy. And with stadiums 30,000 feet in capacity, you have these TFRs, which are a 3-mile radius up to 3,000 feet AGL, essentially an hour before the event starts to an hour after. Always check NOTAMs, always check TFRs. That's really the takeaway here. If you do choose to fly with ADS-BN, another added benefit, you get this information. TFR information can be pumped in or pumped up, as it were, with ADS-B to the aircraft itself. So you can see exactly where these TFRs are located essentially in real time. But these can catch people off guard, so I can't kind of underscore that, the importance of checking for TFRs enough. For those of all you pilots that may be on that either are in the Northeast or intend to be in the Northeast, do be aware of the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area. If you intend to fly VFR within 60 miles of the DC AVOR, it's required by regulation that you undergo special training. And the big takeaway here is you can't do anything traditional VFR in that airspace any longer. Everything you do, VFR, IFR, you're required to be identified, meaning you have to be on a discrete transponder code. And that has to be done before you're airborne or before you enter the airspace itself. It is required that you undergo the free online training, but there's not actually a specific recurrent training requirement. So that's something that you just might want to be aware of, and you might want to take it upon yourself to do. Personally, I take that training whether I think I need it or not. I typically do on about an annual basis. But there are some nuances to be aware of if you're flying in that area. Let's come back a little bit to ADS-B, or automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, which may be new to some of you, was a requirement or is a requirement in a lot of airspace now in the United States as of January 1st, 2020. So let's break ADS-B out, ADS-B in or out. Okay, it is ADS-B in general. It's information. It's either information coming from the aircraft to air traffic control, or it's information that's being broadcast from a series of ground-based stations up to the aircraft. In a very high-level general sense, it's all part of FAA's next gen. It's modernizing ATC. It's a replacement for traditional radar. It's more information available more reliably, more consistently to ATC and also to other aircraft. And it specifically is tied to a unique aircraft via the installed equipment on board. So we refer to ADS-B out is the information about your airplane that's being broadcast to ATC. And then we refer to ADS-B in, which is totally optional. But if you have the receiving equipment, which can be installed or it can be a portable receiver, If that's coming up to you in the airplane and you're taking advantage of that, we refer to that as ADS-B in. So the requirement is ADS-B out in certain airspace, which we'll talk about. The option, which was done partly as an incentive to get pilots' aircraft equipped with ADS-B out, the ADS-B in is all that weather, traffic, NOTAMs, TFR information, radar, METARs, TAFs, et cetera, that we talked about before. And the ability, of course, to display that either on a portable device or in some aircraft, even on installed equipment. This is really kind of a repeat, but been transformative technology. This has really brought a comprehensive kind of 3D picture of situations, of changing weather conditions, of attitude information right to the cockpit. And for so many pilots has really become indispensable. One of those, I do not dispatch unless I have my ADS-B information available to you. Kind of a hot topic when it comes to flight reviews or making sure pilots are current is understanding, A, is my aircraft equipped with ADS-B out? Because it doesn't have to be if you're going to avoid specific airspace. But for all the airspace we have listed here, and as noted in the graphic that we have available to you right now, and back to January 1st, 2020, the aircraft is required to be equipped with ADS-B out. So if you're a renter pilot, if you're intending to join a flying club, that's certainly an obvious question that you're going to want to ask. If you're shopping for a new airplane, that's a key element. Is this aircraft ADS-B out equipped? You have to have an all Class A, of course, Class B, Class C, and even Class E, just like transponder use anytime you're going to be above 10,000 feet with the carve out for when you're 2,500 feet AGL or less. Those are the basics on ADS-B airspace requirements. Let's talk briefly about regulations. A couple of regulations we want to talk about. Number one is minimum safe altitudes. So do remember that there's a catch-all, and there's several regulations in Part 91 that I would refer to as kind of catch-alls. You know, one is becoming familiar with all available information with respect to a specific flight, right? It's very far-reaching, very overarching. The same goes with altitudes. Your minimum safe altitudes always obligate us as pilots to have some form of contingency plan when it comes to emergency landings. So it's always our obligation, just like looking for other air traffic, to also always be making contingency plans in the event that we have to make some kind of emergency landing so we don't cause undue harm to any other people or property. More specifically, related to minimum safe altitude, over congested areas, you always have to stay at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle and 2,000 feet horizontally from that obstacle. Congested areas being defined as you would look on a sectional chart or terminal area chart, any of that area that's yellow in color that indicates congested areas. Other than congested areas, so outside of that yellow, the minimum safe altitude drops to 500 feet. And then there's an exception to that if you're over open water or sparsely populated areas, 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Had an interesting question from a student recently about what the open water definition really is. And the FAA does define it, but again, back to the sectional chart, it's bodies of water that are the lighter blue in shading. So typically inland waterways, rivers, lakes, those don't qualify. Typically, you'll see those shaded on the sectional chart and TAC charts in a darker blue, and those would not qualify as open water. But the larger bodies of water, the Great Lakes, of course, those would certainly qualify. How much fuel are you required to carry? Well, from a regulatory perspective, and this is a great example where I would say that legal doesn't necessarily make it safe, but in the daytime, you always had to have a 30-minute fuel reserve at an absolute minimum, and at night, a 45-minute fuel reserve. Now, does that mean if you land and you had less to that, you're in violation? Not necessarily, because if something occurred on your flight, whether that was a weather deviation, whether that was a stronger headwind than anticipated, and you chose to dip into those minimum reserves, that doesn't necessarily indicate you were in violation. This is for planning purposes. You're supposed to plan to have that type of minimum reserve. My quick advice, what I have always advised all of my students, all of our clients here, 1 hour. Always have 1 hour of fuel. That is, there's no other way, there's no quicker way in aviation to make for an unpleasant experience than to be sweating out or being nervous about your fuel supply. If you're getting nervous, if you're questioning, if you're making last minute calculations, likely you're cutting it too close. Stop and get fuel. Some additional resources with respect to just risk management in general, risk assessment, always available to you in the handout section. Specifically there's some resources there that direct you to making sure you personally or physically are ready to fly the aircraft. I think that's one aspect that we see, that I see with clients typically, is that they're very good at assessing, external factors and evaluating weather conditions and the aircraft itself in terms of airworthiness, but oftentimes don't take a moment to self-assess. How am I feeling related to fatigue, related to emotion, stress? Those can have very, very serious effects on our ability to make good, sound, safe decisions. So I'll emphasize again, take some time to make sure that you feel good about the situation you're going into, and don't underestimate specifically the effects of medication, even over-the-counter medications. Antihistamines are a common source of, I don't want to say abuse, but I would say pilots flying in times where they really shouldn't be because their faculties could be compromised in some manner. So make sure you're paying, if you are taking medications, especially allergy medications or cold medications, pay close attention to the warnings and the active ingredients on those medications to ensure that it's not going to make you drowsy or not compromise your faculties in any way or cloud your judgment ultimately. I want to get into weather as our next topic. And again, this is certainly not intended to be comprehensive, but I will refer you or point you towards some of the dedicated aviation weather webinar presentations that we have posted in the Sporty's webinar archives. Very in depth, excellent. We have some meteorologists involved. We have pilots involved. We have a lot of scenario-based training for you. And the other thing I would encourage you to do with respect to weather, play the what if game. Whether you have a flight coming up this week, next week, the week after that, choose some arbitrary days, plan some fake flights, play the pretend game that you're going to fly from this airport to this airport, and take the conditions of the day and really go through a thorough assessment. Go through a weather briefing like you would for an actual flight, and then in the end, make your final decision, whether you would go, whether you're not going to go, whether you're going to go but have some contingency plans in place, maybe some alternate routing. Those type of things are a very healthy exercise, and even getting some other pilots involved can be very, very fun and very valuable, and a way to kind of get everyone involved in the process. This isn't extensive, but two excellent online weather resources that are available to you are aviationweather.gov and 1-800-WXbrief.com. You can certainly still call flight service like you always have and talk to a professional trained briefer, and that's always an excellent choice. But a lot of us this day and age, especially with quick internet access on our mobile devices, at home, office, whatever the case may be, will choose to consume or gain access to a lot of this information on our own, and those are two great resources. So just from a high level, several days out, our recommendation, kind of the general flow of the way you should look or analyze information. It's always recommended with a trip on the schedule to start looking at the weather several days out. The forecasting models we have available, the prognostic charts, they have all gotten more and more and more accurate. They're never perfect. So, while the same time I'm saying that the accuracy has gotten a lot better, I will also say, not to contradict myself, but don't cancel on a forecast. It's kind of it would be my general advice right there. It's good to have an awareness. It's good to know what to expect, but that doesn't mean it's 100% going to materialize exactly how it's indicated in the prognostic charts. Online and TV weather, I wouldn't rule that out. Always good to have a understanding where the frontal weather is, where the pressure systems are located. Any kind of major systems that are forecast, that can obviously be a cue as to whether or not you already need to be looking at alternate plans or whether things are looking to be on schedule. A few days in advance, prognostic charts, incidentally, good up to a 7-day outlook. You can see those on aviationweather.gov. Extended convective forecast. Aircraft and convection, they do not mix. So as pilots, we're always interested in convective activity. We have access to extended convective forecast now out to 3 days out. And we also have access to icing conditions, freezing level information 18 hours out, always of interest, of course, to pilots. And the regular convective forecasts up to 8 hours out, all great tools to look at. Beginning with the big picture, or after getting the big picture, you want to kind of think about how a standard weather briefing would work with a calling flight service. You can recreate the exact same thing on your own. You may have some tools you like to lean on a little more than other, but start with convective segments, graphical air mets, which go out to 12 hours out, and then the synopsis, which can include prognostic charts, the surface analysis. Now, graphical air mets are a relatively new tool, and that may be a new term for some of you on board. But this was a fantastic innovation. Graphical air mets replaced area forecast. So if you remember the area forecasts, which were a whole lot of text, a whole lot of tough to decipher boundary areas where certain weather could exist, not a whole lot of use unless you had a very accurate map and you were good at memorizing specific identifiers where VORs, airports, etc. were going to be. Well, now we have access to graphical air mets to help us create this picture here. So graphical air met tool can allow us in a pictorial format, as you can see in this example, to look at turbulence forecast, low level wind shear, wind, ice, freezing level, IFR conditions, and even mountain obscurations. And as you can see on the left slider, this isn't a live demonstration, but you can even choose specific altitude levels that relate to the flying you're going to do. So you can do some filtering, so you're just not seeing everything. And in the upper right of the graphical air met tool, you also have a time slider. So again, you can look at these 12 hours out. Just a great tool to build a good foundation and a good perspective for where's the difficult weather or the more challenging weather going to be. And also, just as important, where are my escape routes? Where can I go in the event that things don't turn out quite as planned? Where's my best escape route? Where are my alternate airports going to be located? This is an example of the graphical air met tool just looking at icy conditions at the 9,000 foot level. So, if you're taking a couple 100-mile cross-country flight, this might relate to you in a single-engine GA aircraft flying at 9,000 feet. And again, we can look at these conditions out to 12 hours out. So wonderful innovations there when it comes to the graphical air met tool. And then continuing in our kind of self-weather briefing, continue to drill down for more and more detail. And this is probably common sense, but as your departure time approaches, you're going to begin looking at current conditions, METARs, en route forecasts, destination forecasts, whether it's TAFs or whether it's the model output statistics forecast, which are TAF-like, but they use some of the forecast modeling available to build these TAF-like forecasts at many airports that don't have traditional TAFs available, because TAFs are not available at actually a great number of airports across the country. Winds and temperature of loft, of course, and those NOTAMs and TFRs. Now, in addition to these online tools, you can also bring all this information together if you so choose in many of these flight planning applications that are available. And there's web apps available just like there are dedicated iPad applications. But if you choose to use flight planning or do flight planning on some of these mobile applications, you can bring in these weather resources, and you can do essentially real-time flight planning by adjusting routes, looking at where convective activity might lie. Here's a look at some of that graphical airmet information that's overlaid on our sectional chart, so we can see exactly, from turbulence, icy conditions, IFR conditions, whatever the case may be, how those might directly affect our flight. So you can start to see that this is so rich in information. This gives us such a, in my opinion, a much better perspective than what we once had. And just to highlight a few other benefits you have available to you if you're going to use one of these applications for your flight planning, you can load aircraft data. This just is kind of infinitely customizable. You can load your own aircraft profiles, so you can kind of instantly see what type of fuel burn you're going to have, what type of en route time, distance. Many of these applications have altitude advising tools where you can choose altitudes and you can see what type of obstructions may create issues to you. The list goes on and on. So certainly encouraging you to explore those topics as you wish a little bit further. And then en route, once you're en route, that doesn't mean the information goes away. This is repeating a little bit, but even when you're away from your internet connection, once you're en route, you have the option of the ADS-B in information as long as you have a receiver. That can be a portable receiver that you carry around in your flight bag, or that can be something that was installed or is installed in the aircraft and gain access to that ground-based free government broadcast. And there's also Sirius XM, which offers subscription-based, satellite-based commercial information, even more extensive than the free government broadcast. So you have access to that en route, so you're always looking at information. One cautionary note, which has been a source of several safety alerts that have been issued by FAA, is related to latency of weather information on this en route weather, and it's worth mentioning here. But do keep in mind, no matter where your source is coming, if it's not coming from an installed live weather radar, so if it's coming through the Sirius XM pathway, if it's coming through the free ADS-B weather information, specifically related to radar returns, that is not real-time information. There is significant delay in that information. It can be up to 20 minutes, and there's two sources of delay. The first source of delay is that what we look at when we look at those pretty composite radar images, those have been massaged. Those have been, professionals have taken a lot of raw radar data that wouldn't mean a whole lot to us, and they've compiled that into what we call a composite picture to make it more reliable, and provide us with more information on what is really happening from a convective or precipitation perspective. So there's the delay in creating the composite image. And then there's, second to that, there's a broadcast delay. There's the time it takes the composite radar imagery to be sent and then to be broadcast out and received in the aircraft itself. And when you combine those two sources of delay, it can be, this would be on the extreme end, but it can be as much as 15 to 20 minutes. The key takeaway there: don't rely on that type of information for close-in tactical weather avoidance. It's for long-range planning. It's for wide berth weather avoidance. It's not live radar, is really the takeaway there. Another greatly underutilized resource that we all have available to us absolutely free is using ATC, especially for the VFR pilots out there. You have access to VFR flight following. For whatever reason, it seems to be a source oftentimes of trepidation for pilots to voluntarily engage air traffic control and have to identify themselves and have to do some communicating back and forth. But it is just a wealth of information. It's another set of eyes on traffic. It's another set of eyes on potential weather situation. It's another resource to access in the event that something goes wrong in the airplane and you need assistance. So VFR flight following, again, is a service available to all of us as long as you're in radar coverage, which I would certainly recommend we all use. A couple disclaimers on VFR flight following. A, it's done on a workload permitting basis. ATC's number one job is to separate IFR traffic. So if you're a VFR pilot, this is kind of secondary. You're kind of secondary in terms of their priority level. So it doesn't absolve us as pilots from seeing and avoiding our own traffic and also taking care of our own weather avoidance. So you should not rely on VFR flight following solely for anything, but it is another backstop to you. And there's another great handout in the handout section that gives you some more information on what flight following is all about and how you would go about interacting with ATC and requesting those type of services. Let's get into some traffic pattern and radio communication talk for just a bit. Something that may be a little bit new for most of us is a relatively recent change in the Aeronautical Information Manual that advises pilots to keep your lights on, as many of your lights essentially for as long as you can to help your visibility so that other aircraft are able to see and avoid, and this even includes ground operations. So the recommendation now, which may have been different than when you first learned, is that of course anytime the engine is running, you should have your rotating beacon on. You should also, unless, and this is a big unless it creates some kind of safety hazard for other aircraft or even yourself, you should have your anti-collision or your strobes on. A lot of pilots, again, will choose to have those off for ground operations, and that makes sense. You may also choose to have those off if you're an IFR pilot flying in clouds, because it can create some distraction, if you will, the reflection off the clouds. Position lights should be on for not only night operations, but also all ground operations. If you're going to cross a runway, you should turn on all your exterior lights. Again, this helps with ground-based traffic conflicts. It just helps other pilots or other aircraft see that your airplane is on an active runway, which is, of course, is a greater risk. And when you're entering the departure runway, you should have all lights on except for the landing lights. And once you do turn landing lights on, that's a signal to any aircraft crossing the runway, anything else that may be on the runway, even though they shouldn't be, that you are beginning a takeoff roll. That's what that kind of universal symbol for turning the landing light on as you're entering the runway for departure should be. And you should always have your lights on, all lights on within 10 miles of the airport when you're approaching as well. Traffic patterns. If you surveyed 10 different pilots, you're probably going to get 10 different opinions on the necessity of traffic patterns, when to fly a traffic pattern, how you should fly a traffic pattern. The bottom line is we really only have one definitive source of advice on this, and we should all be adhering to what's written in the Aeronautical Information Manual. And part of why we fly a standard traffic pattern is to make sure we have ourselves set up for a good stabilized approach. It gets us kind of into a good starting point each and every time, but also so that other airplanes know what to expect. Because if we were all doing something a little bit different at each airport, you can understand how chaotic that might get. Radio calls essentially boil down to, as you're inbound making a call 10 miles from the airport, of your position and what your intentions are going to be, and then entering each leg of the traffic pattern and also departing the active runway. As you're departing a non-towered airport, the radio calls are when you begin taxiing, when you're taking the runway for departure, and then when you're departing the traffic pattern itself. Kind of some good elements to remember. Don't expect that everyone, even though we're advising everyone on here to use standard traffic patterns and standard calls, always anticipate that others may not. So just because you're not hearing any airplanes doesn't mean that other airplanes aren't out there. So continue to be vigilant in scanning for traffic, be disciplined in executing your regular traffic patterns, and that's certainly going to be a better way to fit in to a traffic pattern at any airport. Standard traffic pattern entry is 45 degrees to the downwind, but there are a couple of accepted alternate entries, and that would be if you are approaching the traffic pattern from the opposite side of the downwind. So one option that the IM provides is to overfly the traffic pattern at least 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude, and then make a teardrop descending pattern to the downwind leg. Certainly an option, not my first choice, only because in this case, what I believe is that descending teardrop pattern creates some natural blind spots that make it very difficult potentially to see other aircraft that could be approaching the downwind at pattern altitude from the downwind side. But if you look at option 2 in this figure that's on the screen, you'll see this accepted alternate pattern entry is to enter over top of midfield, essentially on a crosswind leg, again at pattern altitude, and turn immediately to downwind. I think the benefit to this is visibility. Lights on, you're at pattern altitude, you can clearly see you're any airplane entering the downwind from the opposite side. You should have good visible contact with, and you should be able to meter yourself appropriately to fit into the traffic pattern. Position and hold, if you're familiar with that term, used at towered airports, that's a relatively recent change. That's now line up and wait. So if you hear the line up and wait, that used to be called position and hold, and that means you can enter the active runway and you can get yourself aligned with the runway center line and then stop and wait for your takeoff clearance. Do remember that line up and wait is strictly an ATC function. It's not a non-towered airport function. It's not something that pilots should ever do on their own. And even the airports that are able to do position and hold, they have been decreased a great deal. Airports that do position and hold, they have to have a justification for doing so. They have to have a specific procedure and a need. So it's something that's being done less and less, and something that should never be done at non-towered airports. You should never loiter on an active runway, anytime, of course. As we kind of draw to a conclusion of our hour, I want to offer some additional items to consider as you get back, of course, to the left seat, as you get back to active flying. And I talked about the value of involving other pilots, but not just involving other pilots, but involving your support network. We all have a support network. That could be a spouse, that could be other family, that could be friends. But aviation is a community. Aviation in a lot of ways is a lifestyle. You're more likely to succeed. You're more likely to invest more time in staying proficient and learning new things if you have that full support, if you have other active participants around you. So do whatever it is you can do. And again, I know present day, most places we aren't inviting crowds of people, but there are other ways, whether it's study, whether it's virtual learning options, that you can involve your support network. But get everyone kind of involved in what you're doing and make sure everyone supports what you're doing. There's a lot of good aviation apps out there. So if you have an iPad, if you have a phone, if you're going to procure one, take some time to explore, take some time to download apps and get familiar. Learning an application is not unlike learning some new avionics. It'll take you a little time to figure out where certain information resides and how you're naturally going to interact with the application. What you're going to start with, where you're going to get this piece of information, what information you're going to display most prominently or most frequently. So take some time to get comfortable with that. I certainly would not advocate towards, if you're new to an iPad EFB device and you're an IFR pilot, I would not recommend jumping right into instrument actual conditions. Take some time to get familiar. Maybe have a transition period where you're also carrying traditional paper charts. Always have a safety pilot with you, maybe an instructor with you, to help kind of practice the routine until you get comfortable. Legal doesn't mean safe. I referenced this several times with respect to our regulatory review. If you don't already have a solid kind of personal minimums procedure, maximum wins, minimum visibility, alternate airport requirements, I would certainly suggest that you establish that. And if you've been away from the aircraft for some time, you're probably going to want to start out pretty conservative and kind of work your way down. Um, some of the handouts, the risk mitigation tools, they will help if this is brand new to you, that they will help you kind of establish your own process, your own risk assessments, your own personal minimums. Um, but don't let the access to information lull you into a false sense of security. Because even though, we have access arguably to more information more readily than we once did, we still have to execute. The hazards are still the same hazards. So we still want to maintain the discipline that we always have and abide by those personal minimums. Take advantage of so many of these free resources we have available to you. These are a couple from Sporty's, but I mentioned earlier in the presentation, iPadPilotNews.com, free subscription, free resources for everything iPad EFB related. And we also have our studentpilotnews.com. And again, don't let the title of that be misleading. This is not just for student pilots. If you're an instructor out there, there's a lot of good resources, commercial pilot, instrument pilot. We try to give updates with respect to ACS or PTS or new weather tools that are available or new news that's applicable to pilots. So there's something for everyone there at studentpilotnews.com. And with that, we are going to draw to a close for today, but I do hope we were able to get a lot of your questions answered. I would invite you to email us at cfi@sportys.com if you have any follow-up questions that you may wish to put forth. For some of the questions that you submitted that we did not get to, we will try to make some follow-ups to make sure you get your questions answered. And with that, I want to, again, thank you for everyone who's participated and been a part of Sporty's virtual airshow month. I know it was a disappointment for so many of us to be without Oshkosh, but it sounds like we had a great time this month interacting with so many of you. There's still some Sporty specials that you may want to take a look at that are available through the end of the month, through the end of this week at sportys.com. I will invite you and I'll remind you once again that this presentation was recorded. We'll get it posted in the webinar archives. Check back frequently for our schedule of upcoming presentations at sportys.com/webinars. And with that, again, my name's Eric Radke. I thank you so much for joining, and on behalf of Sportys, safe flying out there to all.